All right. So just to get us started, real quick, I just wanted to let folks know or remind you to make sure you're on mute unless you're called on to ask a question. And the speakers are happy to answer questions throughout the presentation. But if you do have a question, please use the raise your hand function, and then we'll call on you and you can ask your question. And yeah, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brenda to introduce the session.
Hey everybody, I'm Brenda Koner. I'm the director of Alaska EPSCoR, and I just wanted to thank everyone for registering, but I especially want to thank the editors of GEMBI for agreeing to talk with everyone and put this on. Hopefully you guys will find it super informative and it will assist you in getting those papers published. So I'm going to turn it over probably to Will, because I think you're the editor in charge these days. And I'll let you introduce yourself and others, and then you can go ahead and just get started.
Great, thank you, Brenda. And I'll just start off by sharing the PowerPoint we'll look at today. So hi, I'm Will White. I'm an associate professor at Oregon State University, and I'm one of 3 of the editors-in-chief of the Journal of Experimental Marine Biology and Ecology, which is a mouthful, so we just call it GEMBI. And I'll let my co-presenters introduce themselves as well. Stephanie?
Hi, everyone. My name is Stephanie Kamel, and I'm a professor at University of North Carolina, Wilmington, and I've just recently become one of the co-editors-in-chief of GEMBI, and so I'm really happy to be here today to participate in this discussion.
Hi, I'm Peter Petratus. I've just stepped down as one of the editors-in-chief. I've served in GEMBI for 7.5 years. I'm actually retired from the University of Pennsylvania, where I was all of my professional career as a marine ecologist. Back to you, Will.
Great, thank you. So what we're hoping to talk about today is some of the mechanics of the publication process, but also some of the ins and outs and sort of behind the scenes aspects of publishing, what makes a good paper, how to navigate the process. And that's because this is a vital piece of your scientific life. It's how we succeed and get promoted. It's the way we communicate our science. But a lot of it happens behind closed doors and is shrouded in sort of anonymity and secrecy. And so there's a lot of things that sort of nobody tells you. And so we're hoping to tell you those things today. And so I'll do a lot of the talking for the first little bit. Again, if you want to raise your hand, if you have a question along the way, we can do that. But then our hope is to leave a little more than half of the hour at the end for just questions for all 3 of us. So, you know, I think we all know why we're here. We're talking about why we want to get published and why we participate in the peer review system. You know, the reason that we publish papers is because you've done all this hard work and you want to tell the world about it. And this is how you tell the world. You know, the peer review process is a way to get objective critiques of work and ensure that the field is moving forward with sort of best practices and a common sense of the right way to do science and the right way to test hypotheses. There are other ways of communicating your science. You know, you could write a blog post, you could post things on a preprint server. The purpose of the peer review and the journal system is to some degree a sort of quality assurance. You know, as a consumer of science, that if it's in a peer review journal, it's been through some type of review process, it's been critically evaluated, and you don't have to do that evaluation on your own. You don't have to be the first person to read this and say, oh, is this really the right way to do this experiment? That sort of thing. Somebody else has done that work for you, right? This is also obviously really important for career advancement. This is one of the major ways you get hired, get promoted, and get grants. There are a lot of critiques of the peer review system. There's an article I've posted here from Science several years ago. It's imperfect. There are a lot of ways that bias and discrimination can be introduced. There's lots of opportunities for sort of scams and grifts and things like that. And navigating all those little ins and outs is a lot of what we want to talk about today. This is a system that depends on a lot of free labor from the scientific community. And so a theme of today is how to be the best participant in this system that revolves around good faith on all parties, and how to be sort of a good citizen in the scientific community. And I think a theme that's going to come out through all this is how to make it easy for these colleagues, these anonymous often colleagues, to do their jobs and help you get your science out there. So I will start by talking about just the mechanics of the peer review process. We'll talk about things to think about as you're submitting your paper. We'll talk about how you respond to those terrifying reviews that you get when you are in the revision process. And then I'm going to end up by talking about some of the ideas surrounding diversity, equity, and inclusion in the peer review publication process. Okay, so just the mechanics of how we publish papers. The first step is you write your paper and you go to the journal website, you find the button for submit an article, and you spend, I should warn you, longer than you think you will, filling out all the forms and entering everybody's information and the names of all your co-authors and their affiliations and who funded it and all that sort of stuff, and eventually hitting that button and submitting it, and then it goes off into the void and you have no idea what's happening behind the scenes. So what's happening is that it goes to an editor, somebody like me first, and then I decide whether it's going to go to an associate editor potentially, or whether I'm just going to handle it myself. The first thing that can happen is I might just decide to reject it. I do this a lot. At GEMB, I probably reject more than half of the papers that are initially submitted, and that's because they're not appropriate for the journal, right? So every journal has a type of paper that it publishes, and we'll talk about how to think about that in a few slides later. But a lot of the papers I get are just inappropriate. Sometimes I get papers that I think are not sufficiently well-formed. You know, it's the first half of a study, not a full study, or it doesn't really advance the science of the field enough to really merit publication. And so we call those a dest reject. Hopefully what happens, though, from an author's point of view, is that we send it out for reviews, okay? So this is where we try to think of people who are other experts in the same field who would provide good critical reviews. This is a process that's very slow, because if you've ever emailed any other researcher in your field, you know that they might take 2 weeks to respond to that email. And it's the same thing for this. These reviews sit in people's inboxes, and then finally they decide, no, I don't really have time. And then you have to go back and find more people. This is a process that we try to make faster. We have, you know, interfaces as editors that are sort of draw on data from Google Scholar to identify people who are other researchers with related publications, other people who've published in our journal who might be willing to review for the journal. But nonetheless, this is a slow process. What's also a slow process is to wait for people to write their reviews once they've completed them, once they've agreed to complete them. And so invariably, when people are in that month, 2 month, 3 month process after they've submitted to the journal, this is what's happening behind the scenes. It's the editor going into the website every few days and saying, well, do I have enough reviewers? No, okay, here's a few more. Let's try to send a few more emails. Just trying to coax people to do this. This is all free labor, right? We're relying on people to do this for free. And so this is the really slow part of the process. Eventually, we get reviews back, hopefully 2. Sometimes we only get 1. I've had papers just in the past year where I've invited more than 40 people to review, and only 1 person has actually agreed and submitted a review. And so then I go in and read the paper and make sure I agree with that review before I make a decision. Okay. So the editor is then going to make a decision. Sometimes they might decide to accept it, although this almost never happens on the first round. All reviewers, like all of us, are very opinionated people, and there's almost always something that's not quite right with the paper that needs a revision. We can also decide on the basis of those reviews just to reject it. And this usually happens if either the reviewers point out some really fatal flaws in the paper. You know, data was really collected in an inappropriate way, inconsistent with best practices, or you know, the analysis was just wrong. And it's not clear that there's any way for the authors to revise it in such a way that you could make it acceptable. And so we reject. It's also possible they might say, like, look, this is a study that's already been done. We already knew this. This is not new information. Why would we publish this? That's another reason you might get a rejection at that stage. What's more likely is one of 2 different types of decisions. One is what we would call minor revisions, where we think that the critiques are pretty minimal and the authors can fix it, and the editor is qualified themselves to decide that those revisions are sufficient. So we say, okay, revise it. The author has a few weeks usually to make those revisions, submit it back in again, and the editor might then at that stage decide to accept it, right? Or we might say, well, there are substantial enough critiques that we want the reviewers to have another look at it. And so we issue a major revisions decision. This is a much more substantial process to revise it. It goes back out for review. So again, you have that slow process, hopefully a little bit faster because we just send it back to the same people who've already agreed to do this before. And at that point, again, hopefully you can decide to accept it at that stage. Sometimes you should know that, if the reviews were of the sense of like, well, we don't have enough information about the methods, can you tell us more? When the authors tell you more, you might say, oh, well, now I have additional questions. And so that can lead to an additional round of revisions at that stage. You can go through this cycle a few times until it's really ready. In other cases, you might provide those revisions and the reviewer say, oh, now that I see this is not acceptable. Or the author might say, you know what? I don't like these reviews. These are stupid. I disagree. I'm not going to do it. And that might also lead to a rejection decision if you're sort of non-compliant with the suggestions of those expert reviewers. So you can either end up with a reject or an accept at that stage. I should say that we don't do this at GEMB, but there are journals that do this where the decision is one that I haven't put up here, which is a reject with invitation to resubmit. And that's a little tricky thing where basically they want to make it appear that papers are moving through the process faster. And so that reject but resubmit is really a major revisions decision. It just sounds scarier. And it makes the journal be able to say, when you get that revision, that, oh, this is a brand new manuscript, and so we're moving it through the process faster. Okay, so that's just a little sort of gaming the system thing that some journals do. After you get that acceptance, what happens next? Well, increasingly fast these days, we used to have to wait months and months and months. You'll get the paper formatted as what looks like a journal article. You, as an author, it's your responsibility to read those proofs and make sure they're right. There are lots of examples of people who didn't read their proofs, and then they get weird typos in the title and things like that. You can't fix that after the fact. Once it's published, it's published. And so you really have to make sure you do read those page proofs. And then it's published online. That's always a nice feeling when it's out there and published. But your job as an author is not done at that stage, because hundreds of papers get published every day, and nobody's going to read your paper unless you do one extra thing, which is to publicize it. And this is increasingly really, really important. And this can take a lot of forms. If you're active on social media, you can, tweet or Blue Sky or whatever, whatever they call the thing on Mastodon, publicize it, send it out to your network, and tell people what you've done. This can also be an opportunity to take the paper and send it to people that you know who are in your sort of network, like, hey, I did this, check it out, this is relevant to your work. Or even people you don't know, right? This is a great way to meet new mentors. If you've been doing work and that's cited somebody's work, you can say like, hey, your work inspired me, here's my paper, check it out. This is a way that people, in fact, I have a postdoc right now who I hired because they did that. They sent me their paper, I had reviewed it, actually. They didn't know that at the time, but they said, hey, this looks like something you'd be interested in, check it out. That started a conversation and I hired her. So that publicity part of things is really, really important. So that's the basic mechanics. I do want to talk about some of the different details that vary from journal to journal and some aspects of this process. The first is different types of peer review models. Okay, the most common type is what we call single blind. This is where the reviewers know who you are as an author, but you don't know who they are. They remain anonymous unless they decide to sign their reviews. And maybe in the question and answer session, we can talk about the pros and cons of signing reviews. Some journals have moved to what's called a double blind system. GEMB is a single blind journal. We might start talking about moving to double blind because there are some benefits to that. This is where the author basically submits a version of the paper that doesn't have a title page on it, that doesn't have their names on it. So the reviewers don't know who the authors are. And also the authors don't know who the reviewers are. And the idea is that this is a way of removing potential biases on the part of the reviewers because they're not aware of the demographics of the author. They're not aware of who the author is if they have some sort of personal grudge against them, that sort of thing. That can be a particularly valuable thing, especially as an early career person. I'm at a stage in my career where it's really hard to tell that I'm not writing a paper because I cite all of my own papers, so it becomes less valuable the more established you are, but that can be a really valuable thing. There are also journals that have moved to an open, unblinded system where everybody knows everybody. So the reviewers make their identity known. Often the reviews get published alongside the paper itself, sort of in a sidebar on the web, so you can see what the initial critiques were and how the authors responded. And so the idea is that's making science more open. I personally think that makes it more difficult to criticize more established researchers who could then like take out grudges on you and things like that. But again, these different models are maybe something we could talk about in the Q&A later. There are also different publication models. So different journals operate in different ways. Probably the most common approach these days and historically is a subscription-based model. This is the way GEMB works, where it's free to the authors to publish in the journal, but people who want to read the papers have to pay. Usually you're at a university and the university library has a subscription, but this is the thing where you try to go to and get the PDF on the web and it says, oh, don't you want to pay $35? You should never pay $35, by the way. Just email the author. They're happy to send you the paper. But that's the most common model. Another very common model historically, but I think less so these days, is one where there are page charges. This is historically the way it's worked at society journals like the Ecological Society of America. There are journals like Ecology and Ecological Applications. You pay based on the number of pages that are in your article. This is really a throwback to the days when you had like paper journals, right? So it's like $70 a page. Maybe it's a few $100s for a color figure, that sort of thing. Typically at these journals, you also have to pay to read the articles too. That could be something where if you're a member of the society, it's free, or if your library has a subscription, it's free. But that's one potential model. Usually there are sort of scholarships and funding support for those. So if you don't have grant money to pay for it, you can request some support there, some relief from those fees. Lastly, the model that's become increasingly popular in the past decade or so is open access. This is where the authors are responsible for paying to publish, but it's free to anybody to read. And this has a few different sort of ways of happening. In some cases, you have journals that have typical editorial models like GEMB does, but you have the option once your article is accepted to pay, sometimes it's $1,000, sometimes it's $3,000 to make your article open access. You don't have to, but you can. And so that's the way GEMB works. That's the way a lot of other Elsevier and Springer journals work. There are other models that are more, they're billed as more sort of impact or I don't know what's the right word for, but the idea is that the paper is judged based on whether it is sound science, not on whether it's important enough to merit publication, right? So there's just like, did they do it the right way? Okay, we will publish it then. And that these are journals like PeerJ and PLOS One. This is a model where you have to pay. It's not an optional open access. It's by definition open access, but there are often sort of funding support mechanisms. There are also a lot of open access journals out there that are more predatory, where they'll basically publish anything. There's not a lot of high quality editing, not a lot of peer review. They're just trying to move as many papers through and get as many open access fees as they can. And they're sort of flooding the literature with not very good papers. And there are lists out there of these predatory journals. There's, the journal group MDPI has a reputation increasingly of being one of these. You want to avoid those, right? Those are not great places to publish, even though you can sort of publish pretty much anything. Okay, so given all that, different peer review methods, different sort of publication models and funding models and things like that, how do you find the right journal? Well, the most common way of doing this is to look at journal impact factors, right? So Web of Science ranks journals on their impact factor, which is a metric that's calculated based on how many citations do papers in that journal have relative to how many papers that journal publishes. And so, of course, the famous journals like Nature and Science, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, have really, really high impact factors because a lot of people read those journals and a lot of people cite those papers, right? That's fine. What I want to emphasize is that journal impact is not the same as paper impact, right? You could have a really high impact paper in a lower average impact factor journal. And by the same token, you can publish a paper in a high impact journal and it just doesn't get picked up because you pitched it to the wrong audience. And in my CV, I have examples of multiple of those where some of my highest impact papers are in what you might consider lower impact journals because the field picked those up and read them and cited them. I have other papers in what I think are pretty fancy journals that nobody really read. It just didn't go to the right audience, Maybe I didn't do a good job publicizing those papers, but that's right. So I would like to encourage you to think not so much about impact factor as the end all be all, but about what's the best place, what's the best home and the best audience for your journal, right? So this gets into the idea of who is the audience? Are you pitching it to a very broad field, like all of ecology, or are you pitching it just to a narrow subfield in marine ecology, right? So that's the difference between submitting to Ecology or Ecology Letters versus GEMB, right? Thinking about who's really going to be wanting to read this, who has the knowledge to appreciate this paper, and who's going to cite the paper. Where's it going to get cited, right? That's the ultimate goal. So this is where you want to look at the scope of different journals and making sure you're slotting things in to the right place. You can look at that scope on the journal webpage. So if you go to the GEMB's homepage, we've got a couple of paragraphs on our scope. It says we publish experimental marine ecology that tests broad ecological hypotheses. This is the case where a lot of people don't read that before they submit their paper. And so I get papers on aquaculture or like marine pharmacology, things like that. And I say, well, this is out of our scope. I'm not going to publish that paper. And so that's where the majority of those desk rejects come in. It's just people not submitting to the right journal. The other thing you can do is look at recent issues of the journal, just see kind of what papers we publish. And then really the best thing to do is to look at your manuscript, see where the papers that you cite were published, and think about those journals as the best places. Now, things you might not want to consider are the little statistics journals like to tout about their turnaround time. That really doesn't matter. That's a super variable thing. It really depends on who's going to agree to review your paper. And like I said, there are ways that journals have of sort of juicing those numbers to make themselves look better. Just don't believe it. Don't worry about it. That's not something you should think about. What you should think about are where are your colleagues publishing, right? Because if you publish in a journal where your colleagues are publishing, that means they're probably going to read your paper. They're probably going to pick it up and they're probably going to cite it. And also think about your experiences at that journal, or maybe your supervisor or your co-author's experiences at a journal, because some journals have really good editorial practices. They take care to make sure they have unbiased reviews. They try to move things through quickly. They respond to inquiries. Other journals can be sort of black holes and have unhelpful editorial practices. And so if you've had a good experience at a journal, that's a good reason to go back to that journal, right? Now, when you submit that paper and you're hoping that the editor makes that decision to send it out for review, you're going to want to think about how do you get your paper noticed, right? And these are some things to think about as you're preparing your paper and as you're choosing your journal. Are you picking the right audience, right? Are you pitching something that's really, really narrowly focused on a very specific subfield to a broad marine ecological audience? You know, I rejected a paper the other day that was really focused on one extremely specific question about one species of whale in one particular location. And I said, you know, that's not something that is really relevant to all of marine ecology, which is the audience of our journal. You want to make sure your paper tells a story. You know, you want to ask a question in the introduction and have an answer for it in the discussion. If you don't have that clear, like, here's what we wanted to know and here's what we found out, it's hard to know what your paper's about and it's hard to justify publishing it. It's hard to get people excited to review it, right? A lot of that is you send these papers out for review and the reviewer might be like, you know, I just don't care. I don't like this one. But if they see something that's exciting, they might say, yeah, I want to read this today. I'm going to write my review right away, right? So that's going to move things faster. You want to make sure in doing that answering of questions that you're telling a story and you're making it broad. It's not just about your methods and your study site, but you're explaining how it is relevant to everything. And that it has a clear take-home message, right? What does this mean for what the rest of us should be doing? What does this mean for, you know, management potentially? How does this advance the field, right? It's not just one more paper, but it's one more piece of knowledge that's going to build the field. Okay. Mechanically and logistically, as you get ready for submission, here's some things to think about, some mistakes that we see get made. Make sure you check the journal style guide. They're going to have instructions. Make sure you follow them. Use a reference manager so that if you get rejected and have to send it someplace else, you don't have to spend hours and hours and hours redoing your references. Increasingly, and you should check this too, journals don't care about formatting so much for the first round or two of submissions. GEMB has now said that we are format free, you know, don't worry about exactly how things are laid out. But if we accept your paper, then, you know, please do it the right way. This is going to be one of my first refrains about making things easy for people. Use page numbers and use line numbers in your document so that when we're referring to different passages, we can say which line of the manuscript we're talking about. That's really important. Please suggest reviewers. It's really hard to find reviewers. So if you can give us a list of 3 or 4 or 10, that's incredibly helpful. A lot of early career researchers are really shy about this, and they feel like they are unfairly biasing the process by suggesting reviewers that they know that they might be friends with even. And I recommend you not worry about that. Let everybody else sort of police their own conflicts of interest. Eventually, if you're a successful scientist, you're friends with lots of people. You know everybody. So if you excluded everybody that you had coffee with, you wouldn't have any reviewers, right? So don't feel bad about that. That's the way it's supposed to work. We're supposed to all be able to be objective and things like that. There are rules for conflicts of interest. And so, for example, I follow the National Science Foundation's rules, which say that you don't interact with anybody who you've published with in the past 4 years. But once you're past that 4-year window, of course, you're all part of the same field. You're going to be interacting with one another. It is possible to point out conflicts of interest if you give us a reason. For example, I have an ongoing conflict of interest with another author because we were both expert witnesses on opposite sides of a court case. And so, yeah, there's a clear conflict there that's easy to explain. A lot of people get anxious about writing a cover letter. It's really not important. Most editors don't really read the cover letters anymore. It's not a big deal. If you do write one, just give us a quick few sentences about what the paper's about, why it's a good fit for the journal. Don't rewrite the abstract. This can be extremely brief, okay? Although that is an important place. If you do have some sort of conflict of interest or something important, you need to tell the editor that's where you do that, right? But don't sweat it. Okay, so you've submitted it. It's gone out for review, and the reviews come back. This can be a really terrifying email to get. You're looking at what anonymous people have said about you. It's nerve-wracking. I never read reviews on the first day. I see the email. I put it away. I come back to it after a day, after I've sort of had a chance to breathe and think about it and get ready. But you do have to eventually engage with these things and respond to them. And so the lesson I want you to take away for this is that even if the reviews are negative, other people just did a lot of free work on your behalf, right? They went out of their way to take time to tell you things, to give insights, to give suggestions. You should be grateful, right? They didn't have to do that. And so in return, you want to make it so easy for the editor and for the reviewers to go through your revised version and see how you responded, see that you did what they asked you to do, or understand why you weren't able to do what they asked you to do. So you want to, at every stage in this, make it easy, right? So as you go through your review, you're going to make a document that's your response letter. What I do and what I recommend is take the reviews, paste them into Word, and just split out the text so that every point that they make is a separate bullet point in your response letter, and you have a response point by point below each one of those, right? You can ask peers or your mentor for help in this. What's the best way to format this? What's the best way to approach this? What kind of tone do I take? Ask for help. This seems like a scary anonymous process. It doesn't have to be. You can ask for help. As you're revising things, I recommend, instead of saying, oh yes, I changed this passage, it's on line 526, you can see that I changed it the way you wanted to. I recommend just pasting it right in there. Just say like, hey, you didn't like the way I said it, here's how I'm saying it now. Don't make the reviewer go and chase down line 526. Make it easy, right? It's okay to disagree with reviewers to some degree, but you should do that in a respectful way. Like, okay, I see what your point is, but this is why we are not able to do that. This is why we think an opposite way is better. This is why these other authors did it our way, and so we followed their example. Sometimes you have to say like, hey, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't understand what this comment means. Here's how I interpreted it and did this. But if I got this wrong, then tell me, right? Sometimes they ask impossible things. You can say that, like, you know what, there's no more money to go back into the field and collect more data. So this is what we have. Be grateful, say like, hey, thanks for this point. This is really helpful. You want these people to be happy when they read the response and be like, oh, wow, this person really listened to me. That's great. So it's okay to like stroke the ego a little bit. That's all right. It's also okay in this process to go to the editor and ask for feedback, ask for help. Hey, I don't understand what this person's saying. Can you help me figure this out? Hey, reviewer 1 said this, reviewer 2 said this. I can't do both. They're in conflict. Which do you think I should choose? You can ask for that feedback. We're here to help. It's also always okay to ask for extra time. We want to get the paper published too, but sometimes it does take more than 3 or 4 weeks or whatever. Maybe you're going into the field and you don't have time to do it right now. It's okay. Just ask. It's always okay to ask. Don't be afraid to talk to the editor. And then finally, I want to end by talking about some ideas about diversity, equity, and inclusion in publishing. This is a process that, because to a large degree, it's sort of cloaked in anonymity, there's a lot of opportunities for bias, right? There's a lot of opportunities for minimizing the work of underrepresented groups, taking out personal grudges, things like that. There are things that journals are trying to do to be better about this. I know at GEMB, we've made an effort to diversify the editorial board. We try to diversify the reviewer pool by gender, ethnicity, national identity, national origin, things like that. I make an effort as an editor to go through reviewer comments and make sure that I'm removing biased comments or unprofessional language or overly negative comments and soften them, make them more polite. And it's also my role to arbitrate disputes, right, and conflicts of interest, and we do work on that. As authors, you're pretty powerless in this situation, right? You're really at the mercy of the editor and the reviewers, so there's not a lot you can do to make this process better. But there are things you can do, and this seems uncomfortable, but there are things you can do to sort of minimize your risk or minimize your exposure to these types of biased interactions. One thing that I tell my mentees to do is when they submit papers, initialize your first names, right? So take away any opportunity for a reviewer to have gender bias by assuming the gender of the authors based on their names, right? Definitely, this is an opportunity to suggest reviewers. So if you suggest a diverse reviewer slate, then the reviewer pool that the editor selects is more likely to draw on that pool and be more diverse in its own. And you can also, if you're suggesting reviewers from backgrounds that identify with yours, you're more likely to have that mix in the reviewer pool. And finally, and this sounds uncomfortable, but like networking is a really important part of this. Knowing other people. So going to conferences, meeting people, using social media to interact with people, because I don't have any scientific evidence for this, but it's my perception that people are less likely to have unconscious bias in the review process if they know who the author is, right? If they're interacting with a specific person they know rather than with an unknown person of a particular demographic group, they're less likely to have that bias because they're going to know, like, oh, I met that person, I like their talk, they had a really interesting thing to say. They might be less likely to just dismiss things out of hand, right? So knowing people is a really important part of this process because you're more likely to know the people that are going to review your papers. And then finally, once we cross the finish line and you've published the paper, what do you want to do? Again, publicize your paper. Sometimes you could issue press releases, talk to your university's press office about that. Not always appropriate, but it can be. And then when we ask you to review, please say yes. Please say yes. There's a lot of opportunities and a lot of people who are freeloaders in this process who publish a lot of papers but never agree to review. And a lot of this is just being a good scientific citizen. So please do that. I just wanted to toss in a few examples here. This is, I'm on Blue Sky now, just in the past week or so, but a few days ago, my research associate Jess and I published a paper. I put it up on social media, and a person I don't know said, oh, hey, thanks for this. I just shared it with Oceana. So a paper that I published could have gotten ignored, but now it's being shared around at NGO and can actually be applied to conservation science, right? And then finally, there's this really great paper that was published back in 2009 called The Golden Rule of Reviewing, which gives basically some guidelines for how we should be good citizens of the scientific community. Agree to review. Think about it. If you publish a paper, 2 people reviewed your paper. So that means you should be reviewing 2 papers for every paper you publish, right? That's the rule of thumb. And with that, I think I should stop talking and take questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Will. That was great. I thought it was really interesting. I'm going to open it up for questions, but I'm going to actually kick it off. If you're a PhD student, is there a way or a suggestion that you might have for them to become a reviewer? Is that appropriate?
Yeah, and I'll say just Stephanie and Peter if you want to jump in at any time, but I'll say that I've got 2 answers. One is that as a PhD mentor, I have asked students to sort of co-review with me. And so I'll have them, and some journals have a formal process for that. We don't at GEMB, but I know the ESA journals have this where you can make it formal. But I'll have the the student read the paper and we'll talk about it and we'll write the review together. That's the thing. You want to disclose that you're doing that to the editor, just to be transparent about that. There are ways to, email editors to say like, hey, I can be a reviewer. Really, the best way is to publish a paper first and be an author first. And then once you've published, you're sort of in the databases, you're on Google Scholar, and we can see that we know that you are a published expert in this topic. And so we want to rely on you as a reviewer. Stephanie, Peter, I don't know if you have other thoughts about that.
I'd like to add that most journals can consider asking a reviewer to review a confidential ask. And so I always, if I'm going to have a graduate student or a postdoc look at a paper, I always ask the editor first, if that's appropriate. Usually they say yes, but sometimes they say no.
And I will add that I have asked our senior graduate students at UNCW, by virtue of being an editor and seeing them around all the time, when I have a lot of difficulty finding reviewers, I will sometimes officially invite them to review papers for me. It doesn't happen a lot, but I have used students within our program before.
I've done that too, and they say no. I'm like, what? Come on.
They don't say no to me.
I'm on your committee. Come on. But yeah, that's another place where networking is really important. If you've seen somebody give a talk at a conference, even if they haven't published that work yet, you might say, oh, they are a good reviewer for this topic.
Brenda, were you talking? You were muted.
Yeah, I just noticed that. I was just gonna try to get people on. If you guys have any questions, now is the time to ask.
Well, I can jump back maybe to start a conversation. I mentioned something early in my talk that I thought people might have a question about, which is what happens when somebody signs a review, or should you sign your review? And that's something that is, I think a lot of first-time reviewers are nervous about. They feel like, oh, maybe I should, or, when do you? Because you see it happen when you get your reviews in. And I recommend that early career scientists don't. It's too risky. You don't, even if you think you're being flattering in your review or something, people might take it the wrong way. There's a lot of opportunities for anonymous retribution. And so I just don't recommend I do it.
I had the opposite.
Yeah. You're
the opposite experience. So early in my career, I was already had a faculty position at that point. I was at a conference, and behind me, I overheard somebody, didn't realize I was standing behind them, complaining about an anonymous review, and it must have been written by Peter Petratus because it was really tough. I didn't write that review. And at that point, I decided, well, if I'm going to get blamed for things I didn't write, I'm signing everything. And so from the time I was maybe a junior assistant professor, I signed everything. And I paid for that. It actually harmed me early on in my career, I think. But people know that they get a read from me, it's signed.
I think you just reinforced my point, Peter, but that's but bravo, yeah.
I have a question, but I can't find the hand raise button, so apologies that I'm jumping right in. But for the publication models that you went over, so subscription-based, page charges, open access, obviously, I mean, this might be opinionated, but I think open access is the best, but like for a first-time publisher, is there one that's typically better? Or I guess what are like the pros and cons?
Yeah, so I'll say that the cons is that it costs money, right? And so a lot of, to the degree to which you have grant support, a lot of institutions have internal support to support open access fees. A lot of university libraries increasingly have agreements with journals to support open access. And so this is a case where, I mean, open access is really great, right? Especially if you want to do anything that's going to be read outside of university. If you're doing something that you want a management agency to read, open access is really important because they're not going to have a subscription to the journal, right? So those are really great reasons to do open access. but ask around to make sure you're not overlooking some source of support for that. I do think that there is a sort of an equity aspect to this, where GEMB actually publishes a lot of articles from the global south, from nations where there's not a lot of institutional support for science, and those authors publish in GEMB because it's free, right? And so I don't want to say that the subscription-based model is wrong, because I think it gives a lot of opportunity for authors. We also publish a lot of grad student papers for that same reason. You know, you've graduated, you're not at the institution anymore, you don't have any source of support for that particular project, and so it's a great place for that. Yeah, Robin.
Hi, if you covered this earlier, I'm sorry, I got in a little bit late, but I was recently asked to review something and it just seemed very, very, very close to the topic that I'm just about to publish on. So I sort of turned them down, plus I had some timeline issues, but I wasn't sure that I really understood when it's inappropriate to be a reviewer if you're like, you have competitive interests.
I'm going to toss that to Stephanie or Peter.
Yeah, I'm not. You
Go
can
ahead,
jump in.
Stephanie.
I think we all, not if you're the only person doing the thing that you're studying, I think you might be studying the wrong thing, right? So of course there's going to be a number of us that are investigating the same kinds of questions. And so I don't think that it's wrong to good faith review a paper that's in your field. I think it would be wrong if you had some sense of, well, I want to maybe see what they're doing or take what they're doing or something like that. But in my mind, barring sort of very standard conflicts of interest, I think it's appropriate to review things that overlap with your research interests.
I have the opposite take on that, particularly for early career people. I think your tendency was that you're going to be maybe overly critical, not give a fair shake to that. And I think you might say to the editor, I'm working on the same sort of thing, so maybe you should take my review with a grain of salt. I'm not sure you should review or shouldn't review, but I would probably advise a student of mine not to review it, so just not to get tangled up in it.
One thing I didn't mention, if you haven't provided a review before, is that when you submit your review report, there's sort of two boxes you fill out. One is a box where it's just stuff that the editor sees, and one is the message to the authors. And usually everything you write goes into the message to authors. But that box to the editor is a great place to say things like that, like, hey, I'm working on this really similar thing, or, hey, I've had an argument with this person in the past. So, just be aware that maybe you want to take my review with a grain of salt. I feel like maybe I was too critical, or, things like that. Sometimes I'll have a reviewer say like, hey, this was clearly a student project and they had some constraints on the resources. So it's not maybe at the level I'd like to see, but, let's be kind in evaluating them. Sort of things like that.
And I think it's a good place to qualify your reviews. Maybe if you were pretty comfortable with some of the underlying biology, but the stats you were maybe less familiar with, it's appropriate to also send a note saying, I might be a little bit more limited in my ability to evaluate the stats, but I feel fairly comfortable, with the biology and things like that. So the message to the editor is a good place to put potential concerns or sort of caveats you'd like to discuss with us and not necessarily maybe have the author see.
I'll jump in with one of the things I sent to Tara, 2 articles, which this is not about mechanics, but more about strategy of your papers. There's one is about a paper that Pablo Miguel, who was an editor-in-chief, wrote a number of years ago. We're looking at why marine ecology papers aren't published in general ecology literature picked up. And one of the points he makes is that in many cases in marine biology, papers start off talking about the organism, very, very specific, and not setting a large conceptual question. And for that reason, nobody's really interested, unless if somebody's interested in exactly the same organism, it's not going to be picked up. So think about when you're writing the introduction, what's the big, maybe it's not that big, but what's the biggest conceptual question you're trying to address? And set it in a larger context where somebody who's a plant ecologist might say, hey, that's interesting. I want to take a look at it.
And I think you have to be thinking about who you want to read, who you want to be reading your paper, like, like Will said. And I've been thinking about that a lot. Just what am I reading these days? And when I was a grad student, publishing in American Naturalist, that was the thing to do. I haven't read an AmNat paper in what feels like 100 years. I just don't read that journal anymore. And so I'm really thinking about what are my colleagues reading, and who do I want this information to get to? And so as an example, we have a mating system variation paper in seagrasses, and you can take two tacks. You can take it on sort of characterizing mating systems or sort of a more seagrass ecology perspective. And to be honest, the mating system piece maybe isn't that, it's not the most interesting, but the mating systems as it relates to seagrasses is the interesting piece. And so we're going to target that for a more marine journal, because those are the people that I think would really get a lot out of reading that. And so, take a minute to think about what the main message of your paper is, and that might be the most appropriate journal. But I would say you have to write the thing, right? So PhD students are amazing at gathering data. You're awesome. You just do it all the time. And then you end up with all this stuff and nothing gets written and put out. And so definitely build some space in there to write up your results and get some publications out as you're doing your degree. So you're not left with this gigantic thing at the end that you're trying to parse out into different papers.
I would also second that about writing. I mean, you have to pick a strategy that works for you for writing. And, what works for me is that when I'm working, I'm a morning person, so I write. And when I was pre-tenure, it was actually between 5 and 7 before my kids got up in the morning, and I would write and I had to write something new during that time. And so pick a time or decide you're going to pick a number of pages, but just find a block that you do consistently and don't put it off.
Great advice. I love it when students at the end come to me and say, "Oh, all I have to do now is write it." It's like, that's the hardest part. Any other questions? Or any other comments from
Another thing about writing, I had a graduate student, she lasted 1 year because she was really great. She came to me at the end of the first year and says, I discovered I really don't like to write. And she was very apologetic and says, this is not for me, I can't do it. And I said, thank you very much. You basically have saved me a tremendous amount of effort after doing 4 or 5 years of research, discovering you actually can't write this thing up. And she went on and did something else and was very productive, but turns out she hated writing. And so that was it. I would say, maybe people are too shy to ask questions. Certainly anyone who wants to email me and ask, with a question, I'm quite happy to respond to emails. I won't speak for Will or Stephanie, but I suspect the same would be true for them.
Also, feel free to throw a question in the chat too.
And I'll actually take this moment to just let people know, if you are from UAF, I do know that the VCR, the Vice Chancellor of Research, does have funding for folks that need help with publications. So if you find yourself with need for funding, don't be shy about reaching out to the Vice Chancellor of Research or having your mentor reach out to her.
And this is actually something Peter made me think of, talking about setting aside that specific time to write. EPSCoR is working on arranging some specific times for writing publications. And so we're going to set that up for the month of October. We're hoping to do 2 times a week. So definitely keep an eye out for that. It'll be a space where you could just kind of come together with other folks working on papers and just a designated time to get something down.
And I'll just add, you know, assuming everything goes well, you're all highly motivated and you go write your papers right after this meeting and you submit them and you get those reviews back. That is still, you know, again, having been in academia for a long time, it's still a pretty personal experience to have these sort of comments and criticisms sent back to you on your work. And so Will doesn't, I used to cry. I've lots of personal growth. I don't cry anymore. But, you know, like Will doesn't look at his, I will read mine very quickly and then I'll put them aside and I'll think about it. And then of course I'll go for a run and think about how stupid they are and how nothing was useful. And then you go back and you read it. And the reality is for the most part, these reviews are incredibly helpful. And so take that for what it is. Well-intentioned sort of constructive criticism, and they do make papers better. And so don't immediately think, oh, that's wrong, or that's not right, or I'm not doing that. For the most part, you're going to really have an opportunity to enhance your manuscript by taking into account the reviewer's suggestions. Just sometimes right off the bat.
I second that. I've been doing this, I just think my first published paper was probably 50 years ago. And I still, when I get reviews back, I read them right away, and I usually have to go take a walk. I mean, I'm so angry, and they're such idiots. And then I calm down and I take Will's advice, which is correct. I say, okay, there's good comments in here. I have to like address them.
Often the comments that you think are stupidest are because you didn't explain things the right way. And the reviewers misunderstood what you did. And you're angry, like, why would you think I would do that stupid thing? But it's like, oh, I'm going to reread my paper. And yeah, you know, I didn't explain that very well. You're right. It does sound like I did this incredibly stupid thing. But I always have to delete the first draft of my response letter because it's all like, you idiot, I can't believe you think that sort of stuff, you know. But I should say, if you read reviews and you really do think that they are wrong or biased or have some kind of fundamental flaw, reach out to the editor and have that conversation. It doesn't have to be a siloed process. You know, you don't have to, you're not like shoving a letter under my door and without me talking to you, that sort of thing. We can have a conversation about the process to make sure you're understanding the reviews properly and responding to them effectively.
Great. And it has come through the chat a couple times and a couple to me that this is being recorded and we'll make the PowerPoint presentation available to all the participants. So no worries if you came in late.
Brenda, did you want to talk about the special issue?
Actually, not really, but I can mention it. There is a special issue that's going to be coming out with EPSCoR research and other research that's related to what we're working on now with the coastal margins part of the Fire and Ice project. And we just submitted the paperwork to GEMBI so that there is a special issue. I think I've sent it around to everyone who I think could possibly submit to this special issue. But if there's anybody online that would like more information, but it's essentially on sort of glacial influence of estuarine communities. So if you've got something that you think fits that, just contact me and we can chat about it. So yeah, thanks for the plug. That actually is a good opportunity.
There's a question that just popped up in the chat. How do you know when your research is ready to be published?
I feel like that's more of a question to talk about with your mentor than with the journal editor. But I think, thinking back to the things I said about, can you tell a story where you ask a question and answer it satisfactorily? If you can do that, and if you can write a paper that does that, then there you go.
I would add one, I agree with that. And I would add one thing that occasionally, I still get these papers where virtually everything is not significant. They've done all these, traditional statistical analyses. And just the fact that lack of significance means you have lack of power. It doesn't mean that there's no biological effect. So if you want to go talk about things not having an effect, that's a very sophisticated analysis that you have to do that's slightly different. But yes, you can publish things that are not significant in the traditional sense, but you need to undertake doing things like effect size and power analysis, hopefully before you did the experiment. But don't submit a paper that basically you've done the usual classical statistics and nothing significant, because I can tell you that that's just not going to fly.
Yeah, so I want to say two things. One is that I've definitely started writing papers and gotten to the discussion as I'm trying to explain the interpretation of something, and I realize there's a piece missing. You know, I didn't complete the story, and so I have to go back and do an extra analysis at that point to make sure I can tell the full story. The other thing, and I see this with students a lot, is you have to have the ability to let go of some of the things you did if they didn't work. And not everything you do, especially as a graduate student, not everything you do is going to end up published. You're going to do experiments that don't quite work, or that didn't, you know, really test the hypothesis in the right way. And it's okay to let that go. And so I think there's a tendency to get very wrapped up in describing all the methods of everything that you've done, rather than picking out the parts of what you did that actually effectively tested the hypothesis and actually sort of worked, and focusing on those. It's, you know, sometimes things just don't get published. That's okay.
Like everyone said, if people have questions later on, you can reach out to the editors or reach out to us, and we can help connect you up with the editors. I see that we are getting near the top of the hour, so I'm going to be cognizant of everybody's time and just thank everyone for coming, especially you guys from GEMBI. It's great to see you, and it's just great that you're putting this on. It's super informative. So if there's any last minute questions, ask them now. Otherwise, I'm going to say just thanks for coming, and we will send around the PowerPoint and the recording of this.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Right. Well, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.